Hi, everyone. Welcome to Craft Politics. I'm Joseph Lavoie.
Hi, I'm Andrew Percy.
And this week we are drinking a beer that we've got from the UK. You brought this one over. Andrew, you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, so it's the Hawkstone Lager, which people might be familiar with Jeremy Clarkson, Top Gear's Grand Tour, and now Clarkson's Farm. So this is the beer that he brews from his farm. And I thought, well, it'd be nice to try one of these. Obviously, he's quite controversial in the UK, has been, or he's particularly locally, his whole farm and all that lot's been some of his farm activities were controversial, but also weirdly has got a lot of credit for actually raising the importance of farming and how hard life is for farmers. So I think people thought his program was going to be a bit of a kind of Top Gear type mess around, but actually it's turned into quite a serious show on the hardships of farming. But anyway, this is one of the beers he produces, and this is the lager. So I have some more back in my fridge in my flat in London as well. So I shall endeavour to bring some more back as well.
Well, it's on first sip. It's tasting really good. How have you been? How's last week?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I was in Nashville for the weekend for Country Music Fest. That was a bit of because I know where there is this whole should everyone be traveling to America at the moment because of the whole Trump stuff and all the rest of it. But I've never really agreed with boycotts, so I went anyway. Also, I really enjoy CMA Fest. But it was good. How about you?
Good, yeah. I ended up I was in Halifax last week for a bunch of meetings. I hadn't been in 15 years. I actually quite enjoyed it. It was nice. It's grown a lot actually in that time. Came back for the weekend, and my one of my kids had his soccer tournament, and it was plus league games. So we had to do something like 5 games in the space of 3 days, and he had 3 games in one day. So I played myself. So I was effectively at a soccer pitch from 6 a.m. on Sunday through to about 9 p.m. on Sunday. It was just unrelenting. So I got a little pigment in the skin this week. I just too much time outside.
Your fake tans, because don't pretend like with your hair dye. I assumed it was the same with the fake tan, but that's what everyone talks about anyway. But it's just the hair dye, is it not the fake tan? Anyway, the only message I take from that is that kids, if you're listening, don't do sport. It takes up a lot of time and really annoys your parents because they have to waste and spend more time with you and waste time driving you around from sporting venue to sporting venue.
It was a lot of time in a car.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, this is why no one should do sport.
Okay, bunch of stories for us to get through this week. Should we start in Canada? I think the big story that I wanted to talk about this week was one that's actually quite close to my heart because it's the entire reason I got active in politics when I was 18. And that is spending around national defense. So the Prime Minister was out earlier this week, Prime Minister Carney, committing to meet NATO's 2% defense spending targets this fiscal year. And that is a big announcement because about this time last year, Trudeau had announced that Canada would hit that target by about 2032. And then Carney came into the campaign and said, actually, we're going to do it by 2030. And so for him to come out now saying, no, we're going to do it this fiscal year is a huge change, and also means it is a massive ramp up in spending. The rate of which I don't think I've ever experienced in my own lifetime. And I say this is a personal issue for me is because when I grew up in the military, as a military brat, my sister is 4th generation in the military, and so it is our life's work in many respects. And I won't bore us with why I ended up not serving, but I had always intended to. But the reason I got active in politics was because I was a kid of the mid-90s, and the kid of the mid-90s was to be experienced in the military when there was massive spending cuts in the military. And so it was very difficult to be within the military family during that time. And ultimately, when I was about 18, I was just sick and tired of living in military housing where the lack of insulation in the winter meant that we could store our eggs and our milk in the cupboards underneath the sink because it was that cold. Oh, wow. And the conditions were not great. And I just couldn't believe this is how we were treating our men and women of the armed forces. And it was that moment that had me go, I want to join a party. I want to get active in politics on this issue. And lo and behold, it would take until effectively now for us to even get close to hitting any kind of rate that is required. Yeah. So because fair to say, I am pleasantly surprised by this.
If we're being honest, the last Conservative government didn't really do a very good job on this either.
Correct.
it's been a cross-party consensus really to underfund the military and underfund military commitments in Canada. So this is, and actually, when I used to come and do delegations here with other MPs, it was always when we got a briefing from our Foreign Office ahead of a visit, it was always oh, and by the way, we have concerns about Canada not hitting its 2% targets, NATO target. And that was always what we were briefed to kind of raise. And it used to really frustrate me because the politicians we'd meet these cross-party delegations of Canadian MPs. Same when they came to the UK, we'd do this. And you'd raise this and they'd all close ranks. And I once asked a Canadian, and it was Canadian, a Conservative MP. I said, why do you all close ranks? They're like, oh, well, we have this thing that if we're out the country, we always defend Canada. And I was like the kind of, like US presidents thing where US Canada's not meant to. I'm like, this is just totally ridiculous. And I don't know why. I said, well, because the Brits, we would just argue amongst ourselves all the time and, crap on our own government. And I just found it really weird because whenever we'd raise it, used to be the most frustrating conversations we'd have because they'd kind of close ranks. As opposed, you think if you were the opposition, you'd be like, yeah, actually, the government's doing a really bad job here. We should have something to say. But it was one of the lines that we were, because it's increasingly kind of become the case that when you think about military capabilities and commitments and all the rest of it, that there's been lots of eminent defense journalists and commentators and ex-military people who've started to question what Canada's ability is to contribute to the Western alliance. Has, some very important skills in AI and in kind of communications monitoring and all that. But the question was, what is actually the military going to be able to deliver? These similar conversations have gone on, but not to the same degree across Europe as well. And in the UK, the military housing one is that what people in the UK armed forces would certainly relate to. But this is great. The question is, what do you to hit it in a year is very significant. And I think that if there's a downside to it, which I don't really believe there is, but it's that money is just strewn about,
lit on fire.
Yeah, lit on fire and that means
Yeah.
you don't get good value out of it, particularly if you know the government's got to spend this money to hit its commitments. Does that really mean that it will be targeted properly? And is there a risk that a lot of it just gets wasted in poor procurement? Because the procurement's the other issue here as well.
Yes. Well, that's my big concern, is that it's a lot of money to ramp up in a single year. Obviously, for all the reasons outlined, I'm deeply supportive of it. But can you actually spend that money in a responsible way against the objectives of what you need to spend it on? That's going to be difficult to do.
Maybe the answer, and this is why I think potentially. So Prime Minister Carney has said he wants to consider Canada joining the European rearm program, which would then open up that rearmament program to Canadian defence production as well, because you have to pay to be a member. You have to pay in to be part of that. So the UK recently just negotiated to rejoin it, and I think it's going to be £16 billion for the UK because it's all about your size. So maybe that's where some of this will go, because he did also in one of his interviews this week on it say that, I think he said something like 7 out of every $10 of Canadian procurement is going to US defense companies or US primes, and he wants to stop that. Means, and he mentioned joining potentially the rearm program in Europe, sorry, not just the EU, but across Europe. So maybe that's how he spends his money quickly, because you have to pay to be a part of that. Now, the bigger question, the interesting questions here is, if you're in the defense space now, there's huge opportunity, but Canadian procurement is very difficult. So with all the rules on ITBs, CAN content, all the rest of it, all these industrial technical benefits have to come. So maybe there'll be a space to renegotiate that, which opens up a lot of this procurement potentially to other people too.
Also, there's good news on this, I think, for our UK listeners. So the amount is in excess of $9 billion is what Canada's got to spend this fiscal. That includes upwards of $2 billion on military aid for Ukraine. So, it's Canada stepping up, doing its part to support the NATO, doing its part to alliance on really difficult defense issues that Europe is dealing with right now, the threat of Russia obviously being the big one. So I think it's an important story because it does mark a rapid shift in fiscal priorities. To your point, there's going to be some downstream effects. Obviously, procurement is not something that's going to get solved overnight and unlikely to get solved in 1 year. But, $2.1 billion towards raises for members of the armed forces. Hopefully that's going to help the armed forces. It's going to be better positioned to recruit more members in the longer term, because there have been recruitment challenges for the military.
Well, yeah, can we
in
just
Canada.
talk about that recruitment challenge? Because the UK had its strategic defense review last week released, which we may talk about also. Oh, we talked about it last week, actually, didn't we? But part of that was about recruitment. And it did bug me a little bit because I thought we have spent quite a lot of people on a certain wing of politics in particular have spent the last few years denigrating the military, discouraging things like cadet forces, discouraging cadet forces and air cadets in schools, left wing political activists in various cities have, been really against that and have been, trying to discourage that. You've had these things where the universities, free activists have prevented recruiters going onto university campuses, into schools. So you've had this whole movement against it, which again points to this freaking stupid position we've got ourselves in the West, where we're so, like, particularly on the left of a certain part of the left of politics, which hates their country so much that they hate their military as well. And the thing that has allowed us to live the lives we live in the freest, wealthiest, most first nations that have ever existed in the entire history of humanity is because we had a military that was prepared to defend those values, and now they hate that as well. So, and no wonder young kids are not getting recruited, and we're having this huge recruitment crisis because they're being fed this toxic thing that their country is evil, that, the military is a bad thing. And of course, wars are bad, but the best way to avoid a war is having strong deterrent, right?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
I'm intrigued to see how that circle is squared, because when you're having the military barred from going onto university campuses to recruit, adults, articulate, educated adults into the military because of these fear from these hard left and anarchist activists, then we've got to take a tougher stand on that, presumably, and have the balls to actually say, no, it's a proud thing to go and serve your country. And sometimes there is glory in battle, in the sense of you're defending values which are, let's be honest, better values than some of the ones we're fighting, because they are about tolerance, freedom, democracy, liberty, all those kind of things. Anyway, there's my rant.
I think you're right. Well, sorry. I actually think that we are potentially turning the corner on some of this stuff. I think there is the elbows up, the wanting to rally around the flag, a sense of greater independence within Canada. I think we're all creating this larger moment, and I hope it's not a temporary thing, because I think there are aspects of this that are very important, very good. And the good and important aspects is if there's a desire to want to have a strong nation where you have some of the fundamentals, like really strong national defense capabilities, deterrence capabilities, contributing to Western order, shaping our values in the world, and having the might to do so, I think are all things that Canada has been lacking for such a long time. And I will be the first to applaud this Prime Minister if he's able to make more gains on this front than we've been able to since the end of the Cold War.
Well, it's the irony, isn't it, of a, liberal prime minister delivering on what many people would see as a very conservative thing, right? Stronger military, bigger spending on defense, all the rest of it. So it's good. I think there's a huge opportunity, though. There is an opportunity for like the UK and Canada to really get their heads together on this, because to achieve what both governments have set out, the Canadian government this week, the UK government in the Strategic Defence Review last week, to achieve what's required, they're actually, why don't we have a new UK-Canada security compact, something where we can do joint procurement, where we can, we have to change some of these rules around local procurement and also just, some of the potentially the canned content stuff, as I say, these ITB. So we're going to have to think about doing these things differently so that we can work together. There's benefit to both economies in that and both militaries in that. So actually, two prime ministers aligned with a similar commitment now, because the argument in the last week in the UK has been how do we get to 3%, and how quickly we're going to get to 3%, and how to pay for that. And obviously, there's even been the talk of the US administration has been saying it wants to force NATO to 5%. Which, but the good thing is, for the first time, defense is going in the right way, in the right direction. But also, I think, to your point, actually now political leaders, be they left or right, across Europe and the West, are starting to realize that we might well end up in a position where we do actually have to go out and defend our freedoms and our system. Where, we always thought that, I think particularly after the fall of the Cold War, people thought, oh, really, there'll never be a conventional war again. If nothing else, there'll be all sorts of other proxy wars. But actually, Ukraine's proven a conventional war is more than possible. So at least you've got leaders talking about us being in a potentially pre-war era of having to build up now. So very sad,
Yeah,
but
and it could be the necessity to reach these targets quickly might mean that that the Canadian Armed Forces actually modernize where it needs to. So, for example, like procurement doesn't have to be necessarily big, massive, multi-year projects and equipment. Can we be agile as a force? Can we procure drones quickly? There's a lot of stuff that I think they're gonna have to rethink some of these procurement things, and I can only imagine that's going to be
the
for a
ammunition,
net
right?
good.
Ammo has been a big thing, right? The fact that we've all donated all the spare ammo we had. I mean, I'm simplifying, right? But we've donated a load of this ammo to Ukraine, but we've reached the limits on some of that where we've been running out and we don't have our own stocks. And then trying to replace that, we've suddenly realized that there isn't the capacity to do that. And we need to be in that position. It's not just about submarines and frigates and all the rest of it. This is actually just about some of those kind of basics that you require and that we have to do quickly, and we've suddenly realized that we've lost capability in this, whereas our potential enemies are not. Of course, they've been ratcheting up and building up, and look, if it serves no other purpose, maybe it's a marker to the Chinas and the Russias of this world that the West isn't in terminal decline, that we're not going to be pushovers, and that maybe we are going to defend our values if required to, because I think for a lot of them, they've been seeing all this internal self-hate and thinking, these guys hate themselves. They're never going to defend what they hate, are they? So I don't know. Maybe I'm just being too maybe this excellent lager has made me too.
Well, speaking about being optimistic, maybe having rose-colored lenses on, the other story I saw in Canada this week that it's not quite connected to this, but it's a signal for me that we should be paying attention to about how long the honeymoon period lasts for Prime Minister Carney. So Canadian jobless rate hit its highest point in nearly 9 years. It's sitting at 7%. That's the data coming out from Statistics Canada for the month of May. The highest numbers since 2016. Only a modest employment gain. Losses among core age men hit a cooling labor market that will shape autumn fiscal messaging. This matters because I think it adds pressure to this fear that we are slowly slipping into a recession. But more importantly, we know that when unemployment goes high, particularly among men, is when you start to get a lot of dissent from the public. It's when you start to see a lot of frustration. And right now, it seems like Prime Minister Carney has a bit of a honeymoon period. He's got a lot of license to do big things like we just talked about on national defense spending. But if unemployment continues to rise, I do worry that the issue sets are going to change, and what is permissible today won't be permissible in 6 months from now. And I don't know, what do you think? Are these employment or the unemployment numbers reason for concern if you're in the Prime Minister's office right
Well, I
now?
suppose can you blame it on Trump? Like, can you say this is a consequence of the economic warfare that's been unleashed on us? Now, but perhaps he can, and perhaps that doesn't matter whether he can blame it on Trump or not, because being in government, you tend to get the blame for shit, even if it's not your shit, right? As we found from the global inflation crisis, right? Every incumbent government got shit on from that, and it was a consequence of COVID and a whole range of other things going on in the world, which were all global, and nobody cared, because it's all right us saying, oh, well, yes, you'll be able to, but actually, if you're the guy losing the job, you're like, no, the government needs to sort this out. So I don't know. I think if any, I would say it's less likely he'll get the blame for it than in other circumstances, because there's a big orange thing you can point to in the
Right.
White House and say, this guy did this. How long people will tolerate that, given that there's been all this talk about, well, we're going to diversify our economy, we're going to do all these other things, which, as I've said many, many times, is fine language, but is very difficult to actually execute. If it were that easy, it would have been done already. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but there'll come a point where people will get tired of hearing that. But yeah, I mean, look, the underlyings of the economy are not great, but then they're not of the world economy, right? Because we saw growth rates cut and slashed everywhere, including in the US. So, but yeah, I mean, this honeymoon, I just saw, I was reading one of
Hmm.
I think from Philip Fournier again today, saying that Carney's honeymoon is continuing, which is interesting to talk about the opposition at this point, is that where Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, seems to have taken a low profile. He's some of the language he's using seems to be much more moderated and careful. He's off fighting his by-election in Alberta to get back into the House of Commons. Kind of like this, just if you're Pierre Poilievre at the moment, you're the Conservative leader, just seems to me like this is a sensible thing to do. Just keep your head down, say non-controversial things, and just let this honeymoon, which is even Conservative voters' views of Carney in polling have improved, including even in Alberta, right, have improved. So you just have to ride this out and see how long this shine is able to
Yeah. And it might be able to last longer than most, just because he's the way he's come out on this. I don't know. He's I'm trying to be as objective as I can. His performance, early days, and as prime minister post election have been very
I mean, as a
strong.
Conservative, he's said a lot of things that please us so far.
Yeah,
it's like it might be the most Conservative prime minister we've had since Mulroney, because some of the others were not that
in many
Conservative.
ways.
That'll be controversial.
Well, should we move on to the
Yeah,
UK?
sure.
The story that caught my eye is the winter fuel
Yes,
U-turn.
my parents are very happy.
Yeah, so you wanna break down the issue?
So
for
you
our
get this
listeners?
winter fuel benefit in the UK that the Labour government, I think it was Blair who came up with it as a way of giving pensioners what they deserve on winter fuel. It's a universal benefit. So if you're a pensioner in the UK, you do pretty well, right? Because you turn out to vote and everybody knows that. They've been heaped on with winter fuel allowance, free bus passes, and then we introduced this thing called the triple lock in government for pension rises, which means that pensions would either go up by 2.5% inflation or the average of wages. I can't remember what the three were, the higher of the three, which has meant that pensioners have actually seen very good growth on their pensions, whilst everybody else has been a bit screwed. But nobody dare take anything off pensioners. And the winter fuel allowance, Labour came in and said it was going to take it off, apart from for the poorest pensions, who were just on pension credit. So if you have no additional income, you get pension credit, you get this top up, which meant that you had a situation where people like my parents, who have very small private pensions from their workplaces, which bring them up to the amount where pension credit is, would end up losing this £350 or whatever it was a year, whereas somebody on exactly the same income as them will still get it. So anyway, I was very surprised Labour went near this, but I thought maybe it's just because pensioners were the one voting group the Conservatives still managed to hold on to. And a lot of people have for years been arguing that this universality of this is not really very fair. You have lots of pensioners who don't need this receiving it, lots who do.
Is it just a top up or a bit of
Just
extra cash
So you
to help pay for the
you get the
cost of
winter
heating?
fuel payment paid to you, so you get it as an extra payment. So there are lots of pensioners who absolutely need it, but there are lots of pensioners who don't need it, and therefore the universality element of it. Now, we looked at this when we were in the coalition government about changing it, and we came to two conclusions. Means testing it is almost as expensive as what it saves you. And did we really want to piss off pensioners? And we answered no to that question. Labour did, and now they've done this massive U-turn, which is going to cost, I think, £1.5 billion or something, or close to.
Yeah, $1.25 billion.
What was very surprising about it is there was a by-election last week in Scotland for the Scottish Parliament, which Labour were under the cosh for, and everyone was saying, the benefit changes, the fuel allowance stuff, this is really going to cost them. And spectacularly, Labour managed to hold on to the seat. And that's actually the other interesting story here, which I'll do now because it relates to this. So one, despite all of this, they still managed to beat the SNP, who were the challengers there. But interestingly, the Reform Party, Nigel Farage's Reform, became a very close third place in that seat. And, we're not that far off winning it, it's a seat in Scotland. UKIP and Brexit was certainly seen as more an English thing because it was England and Wales that voted for Brexit, not Scotland and Northern Ireland. But the Reform Party, who have been out-labouring Labour on some of this stuff, on benefits and all sorts, were a very, very strong third in that by-election. So anyway, my point being, though, that Labour managed to hold that seat despite all of this, and now they've done this U-turn. So I do ask myself whether or not they really needed to do that. But anyway,
they must have get the sense that the political winds are shifting, right? I get the sense with all the recent announcements that government has been making is there's been a deliberate play to try and deal with the threat of reform. Clearly, it feels like a threat of some kind that to take a $1.25 billion hit to your upcoming budget is a pretty significant U-turn to make. I wonder if it was just it was them being scared about the larger threat rather than just, and maybe a feeling that the by-election was a skated through that one.
Well, if you look at the result there, I just got it up there. Labour got 31.6%, SNP, the Scottish National Party, 29.4%, Reform 26.1%. So, for Reform to do that well in Scotland, I think this is like Labour is panicking. They're in complete panic mode. And when you have Reform, this populist right-wing party, out-lefting them on winter fuel allowance, which the Conservatives were also against the cut because we know where our voter base is, but also more generally on other benefit cuts, which we certainly wouldn't support them on reversing because some of them were too child cap on child benefit. So I actually think the interesting thing about all of this, I remember we discussed this the other week, is whether or not this gives the Conservative Party an opening actually in the British electorate to appeal to fiscally conservative centre-right, moderate centre-right voters who are fiscally conservative to say, hey, you have all these other political parties, be it Labour, the SNP in Scotland, Plaid in Wales, Reform Party now, UK, obviously the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, so much as they matter, or the Lib Dems certainly do in a conservative context, given how many seats they took off us. Actually, we are going to be the guys who are going to be the sensibilists. We're going to be the people who are going to say it is not possible for you to complain about taxes as Reform do, whilst also saying you're going to shower people with benefits, and that includes benefits for having more than 2 children. Whereas a lot of reasonable people would say, if you can't afford a 3rd child or a 4th child, don't have a 3rd or 4th child, don't rely on state benefits to have one. That's what a lot of voters would say, right? And there's a space, I think, opening up potentially where the Conservative Party can be that sensible, fiscally conservative, free enterprise, pro-business, aspirational party that says, hey, we're not going to sell you on false promises like all these others are now doing and chasing. Whether or not the electorate more generally is in the mood to hear that, I don't know. But it's an opening, it's a point of differentiation. I suspect we won't take it because I suspect the British Conservative Party will try and do some weird kind of mimicking of reform and probably fail badly at it.
Well, I was just going to ask you. I mean, I like the idea of a very sensible, thoughtful, prudent, fiscally conservative party in the UK. But is that a party that can win in this political context? I mean, we live in an era that is so polarized. You have to be so egregious, so extreme with what you put on the table to capture attention. Like, can just being right down the middle, can sensibility even have any chance in hell of winning in this current climate? And you're thinking they should try.
Look, I don't know, right? If we this is the big dilemma, as you say, right? I think because I consider myself a kind of middle of the road, sensible conservative, that's where everybody else is. Well, not where everybody else is, but that's where I like to think a silent majority of the public are. Right, because they certainly used to be. If you look at the history of the British Conservative Party managing to win more elections than any other party, because we were able generally to pitch. Now, I'm not sure that's the case anymore. But my point on this for the British Conservative Party is, and it could be a strategy that is doomed to failure. I do not know, because the electorate may just have moved on from a position to a position now where I don't understand anymore. I used to think I had good gut for the public. Certainly my 4 stunning election victories in Brigham, I fall before, as the city council would suggest that. But I don't know whether the public has just moved on.
What was your margin of victory last time?
It was embarrassing is what it was. Embarrassingly high. I could almost list the people who didn't vote for me by name and address. Because anyway, but I don't know whether that's the case anymore. But for the British Conservative, and this is my pitch to the British Conservative Party, would be this, is maybe it's worth a try, because we're down to 18% in some opinion polls. I don't know whether mimicking reform and trying to reform will work. In fact, I don't think it will. So kind of like, do you just craft a space where there is something that's a bit different? So whether there's room for that in a populist facts kind of, you have your facts, I have my facts world that we live in today, I'm not sure. So maybe that's a proof of middle age. I'm just like nostalgically thinking back, and I don't know. It's a really good question though. But when the party seems to be as it is, like kind of fighting for survival, maybe this is worth the shot of at least differentiating yourself from the others, saying everybody else is taxing you a lot, everybody else is promising to spend a lot on you, they're not being honest with you. And you can do that whilst also having a strong policy on immigration, maybe dealing with, some of the other more populist things, but maybe just on spending and thing we can say to the public, you know what, someone's got to tell you the truth. I don't know. I mean, I think it's easy for me to sit here when you're not in elected office or going to stand for elected office to be able to say, well, give it a try, see if it works out. Sorry, turns out it was bad advice. Never mind. No harm. No, sorry, you all lost your seats. But they're pretty screwed at the moment anyway, so I don't know. What do you think? I mean, is it worth a go?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the numbers are so low, they might as well try something different. And I've got this theory. It's a really weak theory right now. I haven't really thought this one through yet, but I wonder if we saw a little bit of this with the results coming out of Canada most recently. And I know Canada, we were dealing with the U.S. Trump was the X factor. But I wonder if there might be at some point a little bit of exhaustion with absolutism, extreme extreme views, shock and awe politics, and maybe there will be a return to something a little bit more sensible, something a little bit more honest down and presented down in the middle of the political spectrum.
I think that could well be the case. And you could make an equal argument in the UK for saying the Liberal Democrats could well occupy that space because actually, if you look at the seats they won off the Conservatives last time, it's those sort of seats where that message of moderate, sensible fiscal conservatism would work better than lots of the other seats that we lost in the north to, where Reform would likely win a lot, or we lost to Labour. And maybe the Lib Dems of other people, they've got that space. So again, it goes this thing of with the British Conservative Party of, is it sandwiched between two parties now that are blocks? Because, you arguably could say Labour tried to occupy that space last time as the kind of grown-up sensibilists, not so populist, although they have their challenges from the left, which is just a left form of populism. So I don't know. I mean but I think the Canadian Liberals are a good example of where you can say, oh, actually, that fatigue with the kind of over-the-top language. It's an open question on whether or not the British Conservatives could occupy that space, or could you arguably say the Lib Dems are better placed to do that just because they are able to attract that sort of middle class, moderate home counties, traditionally, Tory area vote. So maybe they've already taken that. Maybe they've already occupied that space. I don't know. Basically, the British Conservative Party looks a bit screwed at the moment, and I don't know what its space is, but I don't think trying to out-reform is going to be the way to victory. Anyway.
Yeah.
But
and Reform probably has a better chance of winning.
Yeah, because people still hate us, because they still hold the Conservatives accountable for either not doing what we said we do on a whole range of things, or actually going down the route of what they would see as very lefty policies. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to pull it's a very Canadian expression, but you've been put in the penalty box, and not just for a 2-minute infraction. It's going to be more than a 5-minute penalty either. All right, should we move on to our to the U.S.? So I think it's obviously a big story this week. Trump ordering the National Guard to L.A. amid immigration raid protests. Governor's gonna, and the Marines. Yeah, so some 2,000 National Guardsmen, 700 Marines. It's a move California's going to challenge in the court. Pentagon pegs the 60-day bill at this thing at about $134 million. Why is this one catching my eye or our eye? Well, it's a sharp escalation of a federal-state conflict, right? So voters and corporates are going to be scrutinizing the outcomes of this decision. And what I'm curious about is, there often seems to me as an outsider observing American politics, there's sort of California and then there's the rest of the U.S. as a bit of a construct or a dynamic that exists. And sometimes it gets reflected into the corporate world. So I'm curious to see if there's a bit of a corporate PR scramble on this. We saw, for example, when Trump first came out on the DEI stuff very early in this second mandate, that a lot of companies followed suit on the issue. But you had others that put a line in the sand, right? It's like Costco is like, no, we're not changing our perspective on this. So I'm curious how many corporate brands will use this as an opportunity to align themselves with sort of that California West Coast ethos on values, and demand a de-escalation of the conflict as a way to pick a fight with the president.
It's a funny one, right? Because I was, so the whole concept of this is very strange to a Brit, right? Where we have policing by consent. Whilst we have armed police are not routinely armed, right? So the view is that, the police by consent, because this overly, which I always found strange even when I lived in America, was like this over-aggressive policing in the land of the free, where they're against the state power and all the rest of it. I just think I got pulled over so much in the US for just driving because there's just police everywhere. The rules are so much stricter. There's very aggressive policing. And I just think, God, this is not the land of the free. You're a much more police state than the UK is.
Yeah, but Percy, you're not allowed to do 140 miles an hour on a 100-mile
Once got pulled
highway.
over for driving, and the guy said, why I pulled you over? This was in the UK. I have absolutely no idea. He said, you just were not keeping within the white lines. And I said, I was trying. I thought I was doing a good job. He said, so obviously I thought you were drinking. I was like, no, this is just sadly how I drive. I was like, he pulled me over and he breathalyzed it. He said, do you want anything? I said, no, I don't need to drink. I said, but this is not good for my driving confidence. I said, because I thought I was driving really well. I was within the speed limit. I said, but you weren't within the white lines. I was like, but I tried my best. So it was a bit of a joke when I was going up because I failed my driving test 5 times. Anyway, moving on from that. I actually think it was more, but I forgot the real number, and I think I settled on 5 in the end. But I have a mate who still says you actually failed 7 times. But anyway, moving on.
We allow you
Well,
to
they
have a
just
driver's
swapped
license.
them.
Did you have to admit how badly you performed on these driver's tests when you applied for a driver's license
Well,
in British
it
Columbia?
was even better when I got one in New Jersey because they just like said, look into this, do that thing on a computer, and we'll give you a driving license. I was like, woo. Anyway, but yeah, they do that here as well, where you can just swap, I think. And but anyway, my point being that
This is why we need more
yes,
police
more aggressive police.
presence to do with
Anyway,
people
but my
like you.
point being though, like, but the biggest point I was making here was like, it was really weird because I looked at this and I was like, well, this is weird, like sending the military onto the streets, particularly when I talk about sending the Marines, because I'm like, does that not risk breaking the kind of compact between the public and the military? People are very proud of the military. And then it's a classic Trump thing again, though, right? Where this is probably the fight he wants to have. I was like, when I heard it, I was like, this is mad. And then I saw
Yes.
some of the videos of like people throwing rocks off highway bridges whilst waving various foreign flags and including the Palestinian flag, weirdly, and then throwing bricks. And I was like, my knee started jerking, and I was like, this is disgusting. Yes, send in the military. Yes, yes, yes. And I found myself in that thing, and I was like, and I just thought, oh, this is what Trump wants, right? So for their core base,
Yeah.
this is exactly the fight he wants. It's exactly the battle he wants. And I looked at those police cars, literally just having rocks thrown at them and smashed up and everything. I was thinking, that's outrageous. Like, this is the police they're picking on, not even the National Guard Trump sent in. This is their local police force. And waving all these, and of course, the imagery of like, illegal immigrants waving Mexican flags and a whole series of other South and Central America flags and other flags as well, attacking the police and the military. I was like, if you're a Trumper, you're like, this is just the perfect imagery, right? Bandana wearing masked foreigner waving a foreign flag on American
Yeah.
soil, trashing America. Now, I know that's a gross over-exaggeration of who everybody was at these protests, right? But that has been some of what's been on.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I just thought, again, for Trump, he kind of quite lucky in the enemies he gets, right?
Yeah. Well, you touched on something there, and it's part of the story that I was thinking about is what's the calculation behind this, and I think you've nailed it on the head. It is a way to continue to mobilize your base. And there's going to be so many people in the mega movement that are going to love the fact that we're sending the Marines
California as
in
well.
to deal with this. To California just has an extra little kick that feels appropriate. But the concern I have is the question I have is what it does in swing states. In swing states, is this the moment where is this one of the things that has those voters sort of rally around Trump and solidify their support for him, or is this the line that seems to be a line crossed too many times? I'd like to think that it would be the latter, not the former, but I'm probably wrong. Probably is the kind of thing that continues to put people who are adjacent to the mega movement closer to that movement. But that could be because I do have this view. Some of it's borne out in some of the polling data I've looked at and such, that America is increasingly getting so polarized, and the polarization is so crystallized. There's almost no room to be in the middle anymore, to have a step back and have an honest look at some of these decisions. I mean, this invoking the Insurrection Act is not a small thing. Or there are three scenarios. This is an act that was written in 1807. There are three scenarios that were envisioned for when this act should be used. It is A, state requested assistance during an insurrection. Don't think this counts. Federal authority enforcement when normal judicial processes prove inadequate. Well, California wasn't even given a chance yet to put any of that to the test. And protection of constitutional rights when state authorities fail to provide adequate protection. I feel like you need to let some of these things bear out a little bit, give them a little bit more time before you decide to throw the military into the problem on a civic issue. But I don't know. But I'm clearly coming at this from a very Canadian lens focus, right?
I think
This
take
just
out
seems so extreme to me right now.
some of the take out the whatever you want to say extremism on on both sides. You take out whether some of the immigration raids are executed in the they're in seem to be in a very aggressive, violent way, and some of the protesters seem very violent. Take all that out of it. The bigger issue here, which I think is the one that I have the most concern about, is it's yet another authoritarian step, right? And it's kind of like, as with all these things, and this is why I was a bit annoyed with like some of the Democrats when they were in power, of like when they did things to Trump after he left office, like taking away his security clearance and all the rest of it. It's like, once you've done it once, it'll happen in the future and it'll happen in a different direction, right? So actually, once you set the precedent that the president can just send the military in under these things, it's okay now, like, them doing it, but you never know in the years to come when there's a Democrat president, this might be getting used in a different way, because once the precedent is breached, the precedent has been breached, right? So there's that element to it of, it's kind of do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. So it's all right now, but when you've got some, right-wing cause that you're protesting about, don't be surprised if in the future some Democrat president comes along and mobilizes the military against you, right? That's one. But the bigger
Yeah.
issue here is it's
Yeah.
just this further example of Trump's seeming ease to use very flimsy legal grounds to undertake quite authoritarian behavior. And, as we've seen him not being restrained by the courts, ignoring the courts, firing people who get in his way. This, I thought at the beginning, when people say Trump's a neo-fascist and, has fascistic tendencies and the people around him do, you kind of think, oh, come on, this is just bunkum, left-wing bunkum, the usual stuff. But you kind of like, as more of these steps go on, you're like, well, there does seem to certainly be an ease with authoritarian, and that, you can ignore the courts because the courts are not defending the people. Well, that's the kind of language that we've heard before in, regimes that have transitioned from, including some that have transitioned from democratic to non-democratic ends, right?
Yeah. I should clarify for our listeners, if I left us with the impression that the Insurrection Act has been invoked, it has not yet been invoked. There's just talk about whether it gets invoked. At least as of this recording on June 10th, it has not, and hopefully,
yeah, he sent them there under some other.
It won't come to that.
I can't remember what the other legal, but he had some legal argument, and there was another piece of legislation he invoked, right, to send them. But this, it's just this. It's very, I don't know. It leaves me very uncomfortable.
Well, the only way to deal with that, I suppose, is
It's
to finish this beer. What are your tastes?
Yes, I thought it was really nice. I got the very biscuity, malty, just really, really nice. I want another one, but I drank mine very quickly.
Well, some of these stories brought us to drink. Yeah, I agree. This is actually really delicious, far exceeding my expectations for what I had in mind for this beer. It has a little bit of that. It's like, to me, it's a little bit like a Helles Lager.
Yes, I was going to say the Italian Pilsner because of the maltiness and the kind of biscuity thing. That was very, to me, was very Italian. Yeah, but slightly more floral, light. Anyway, very good. There are some more in my fridge. Nice. So I will endeavour to, on my next trip, wherever I am, given I seem to be everywhere, I will bring you some further examples of Hawkstone Lager. How's that?
Sounds good. Sounds good. All right, everyone. Well, this was intended to be a bit of a shorter episode. We've rambled on probably long enough, so I think we will call it an episode right there. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you've not had a chance yet, please do subscribe. We'll be back next week in your feeds. Thanks, everyone.